I'm going to simulate 10 seasons of F1, but all cars are going to be equal in performance, and the results might just shock you. For season 1, the championship started in a typical fashion with Max and McLaren dominating. We had a few different podiums, with Hülkenberg managing to get one at Japan, Gasly had one at Bahrain, and Hamilton a win at Canada for the first half of the season. The worst drivers on the grid were doing with 0 points, followed by Behrman and Kimi. After the halfway point, we saw Ocon get a podium at Silverstone, Alonso at Italy, and eventually McLaren did win the Constructors 2 races before the end. However, Max was still leading the championship, and with a late resurgence from Ferrari, with Hamilton winning at Mexico, with Gasly and Hülkenberg getting back on the podium. However, at the final race, Max did manage to win the championship after a poor qualifying and claw it back to 3rd position behind both Ferrari drivers. In the end, Max was the fastest driver in F1 for season 1 by 12 points to Oscar. The worst drivers were doing with 0 points all season, then Lawson and Kimi. The best team was McLaren, Red Bull got 3rd thanks to Yuki's awful season, and Ferrari 2nd. Season 2 started super consistent for the top 3 of Russell, Max and Norris, all being on the podium most weekends at the start of the season, with Max just leading the championship. Leclerc managed to win his home race at Monaco, however that will be Ferrari's one of only 2 wins this season, with Hamilton getting a win at Canada. The worst drivers at the halfway point for this season were Doohan, Lawson and Bortoleto, all with 0 points, and the fastest being Max leading by 15 points. As the season went on, we saw a resurgence from Gasly at Alpine, in which he managed to grab a podium at Monza and later a win at Mexico to put himself further up in the championship. However, coming into the final race, Max had a slight lead on everyone and just won it over Norris by 7 points in the end, making him the fastest man in Formula 1 for a 2nd time. McLaren also won the Constructors again, followed by Ferrari and Red Bull. Gasly managed to finish 5th this season as well. The slowest drivers were Doohan, Lawson and Bortoleto, still not getting a single point all season. In season 3, the championship started with Max being quite poor surprisingly, with Sainz getting a podium at the first race and Russell leading it going into the halfway mark. Max managed to get 2 wins, but his other races were very poor and scoring little points compared to the consistent drivers around him. McLaren were also leading the Constructors at the halfway point over Ferrari. However, in the second half of the season, it was a massive change in the order, with Ferrari somehow being the dominant team, claiming a win at Austria, Silverstone and Monza to actually lead it going into the final 2 races, and the same in the Constructors. But a disaster weekend for Charles at Brazil, and Max taking a win meant coming into the final race, Max was leading the championship for one of the only times this season. It looked like it was over for Charles, but a miraculous 1-2 in qualifying for Ferrari and later a win for Charles and a 6th place finish for Max meant Leclerc won the championship and was the fastest driver for season 3. Ferrari also took the full sweep with the Constructors as well. The worst drivers were of course Doohan and Lawson. For season 4, it was another slow start for Max, in which Leclerc dominated again. The start of the season we had Ocon and Hadjar on the podium, and by the time we got to the halfway point, Ferrari and Charles had a healthy lead in both championships. After the halfway point, that lead just extended with a win at Spa and a 1-2, a surprise DNF at Monza for Leclerc, but a great recovery at Brazil to win the race and the championship, whilst Ferrari also secured the Constructors. As we finished Abu Dhabi and Alonso winning it, Leclerc won the championship by 29 points after another DNF to Max, who didn't even win a single race all season, making him the fastest driver and Ferrari the fastest team for a 2nd year in a row. Can anyone stop them for the future? Season 5 was an interesting season, with it starting rather even and no real domination from any team or driver. Max was very consistent, in which he led the championship but far from winning every race. At the halfway point he had a healthy lead, with McLaren leading the Constructors, but there was still a lot to play for in the second half. However, Max did come out swinging, winning 2 races straight away, but straight after a wave of McLaren dominance, with them getting the next 2 wins and the championship mostly being between Piastri and Max. For Brazil, it was a shock result with Hamilton winning, Hülkenberg getting second and Piastri third to take the points down to 17 in the final race. McLaren also sealed their third title this weekend. It seemed like a long shot for Oscar. He had a great qualifying at Abu Dhabi and was a terrible one for Max, which made it look good for the McLaren driver. And for the race, it got even better for Oscar as he won the race and Max was the actual one bottling it, losing a position and finishing 16th. This meant Oscar stole the championship away at the final race to be the fastest man in Formula 1 for season 5 alongside his team. For season 6, initially looked like Alonso was going to have a good season as he won the first race, but as the first few races went on and Max came out to lead the championship alongside Oscar and Lando. By the halfway point, Max was leading the championship still closely followed by Norris and McLaren comfortably leading the constructors. For the second half of the season, the same form continued for Lando and Max, as well as the odd good result for Alonso again at Monza. But as we got to the final race and McLaren already winning the constructors at Brazil, Max had a 24-point gap and eventually won the championship at Abu Dhabi and was now the fastest driver in Formula 1 for a third time in season 6, followed by Norris, who gave it a somewhat good attempt. This season started off very similar to last year as Max and McLaren both dominated the start of the year, as well as Alonso having the odd good result again. At the halfway point, Max had a healthy gap, but McLaren did start to slowly lose some ground in the constructors to Ferrari. And as the season went on, Ferrari continued this momentum with Leclerc and won 2 races in a row at the start of the season to actually lead the constructors going into the final race, and Leclerc also being in with a chance for the championship as he was only 11 points off Max and George only 16 points off, being very consistent. These were the only 2 drivers to have a chance at winning the championship at Abu Dhabi, but despite the good qualifying from Ferrari and Max, the race was quite the opposite, in which Max finished 4th but eventually still claimed his 4th title in this series, whilst McLaren got a 1-2 to actually secure the constructors over Ferrari in the dire moments. The McLaren drivers somehow always bottle the Drivers' Championship, but they do find a way to always win the constructors. Season 8 started quite interesting, in which Hamilton won the first race with Gasly stepping on the podium. Then at the next race saw another podium for Hülkenberg finishing in 2nd place. However, the driver that seemed to stand out in the first half was Oscar Piastri, scoring a few wins and having a healthy gap at the halfway point. At the same time, Max and Lando was having a pretty terrible year, which meant Ferrari wasn't too far off in the constructors. In the second half of the season, and despite a fight back from both Ferrari drivers, Piastri continued his form and eventually won the championship 1 race before the end at Brazil as he won the race. Ferrari still had a chance of the constructors going into Abu Dhabi, however after a 1-2 finish for McLaren quickly put that to bed, and Oscar Piastri for season 8 was the fastest driver and McLaren was the fastest team in Formula 1. For season 9, Oscar continued his form as well. Max seemed to care about Formula 1 once again, as it was a battle between those two up front, with also a good season from Gasly in 3rd position after a few races into the season. McLaren also once again had a healthy gap up top, whilst Alpine was sneaking into 3rd above Ferrari and Mercedes in the constructors. At the halfway mark, we saw actually Piastri and Max both on the same points, whilst the rest of the grid slowly started to catch up. McLaren had a massive lead in the constructors though at this point. After the halfway mark, Russell had a resurgence, claiming a couple of wins and actually led the championship as Max seemed to fall massively away. However, that soon stopped as both McLaren drivers came back out in front, with Lando giving a good challenge to Piastri. Lando eventually won the Singapore Grand Prix to take the lead, and also McLaren secured the constructors that weekend after utter domination. But going into the final race, it wasn't all smooth sailing as Russell took another win to slot himself into 2nd, only 6 points off Lando. There was also 3 other drivers in slight contention of still taking the title, but Lando didn't bottle it this time as he secured pole position and later a 4th place finish to become the fastest man in Formula 1 for season 9 alongside his team. Coming into the final season, Max had 4 titles to his name, whilst Piastri and Leclerc had 2 and Lando with 1. For the teams, McLaren had 7 titles with Ferrari only 2, but who would get the final championships for season 10. The start of the season was one of the most equal I've seen, with Max and Oscar on the same points once again, with the top 7 within 18 points. By the time we got to the halfway point, Max was leading, but by only 8 points to Leclerc, whilst the top 4 was in close contention. The constructors, McLaren was just leading once again over Ferrari by just 6 points. In the second half, it was still pretty equal, and Max not extending his lead up front, as well Leclerc and Ferrari seemed to have carried a lot of momentum, and eventually going into the final race after Leclerc won at Brazil, he was leading by 3 points over Max, with Piastri just missing out on the title fight. Ferrari also had a comfortable gap going into Abu Dhabi. It was a very weird qualifying as it was raining, with Max starting on pole and Charles 7th. But despite a late fight back from Charles in the race to take 3rd, Max still won the race and just the championship by 7 points to become the fastest man in Formula 1 for a 5th time. Ferrari won the Constructors again for a 3rd time, as well the slowest man in Formula 1 for most years, Jack Doohan, did somehow score 6 points for his final season.